So welcome everybody and good evening. My name is Michael Cowan. I'm a member of the GNPS State Board and also a member of the North Metro Chapter Education Committee, and that is who is bringing you this webinar tonight. So tonight's topic is doctors by nature. So it's the fascinating story of how animals learn to heal themselves or just know how to heal themselves even without learning. Mostly that is through plants, and so that's where the connection with the Native Plant Society comes in. So it's being presented tonight by Dr. Jaap de Roode. He is a biology professor here at Emory, and he's also director of the infectious diseases training program there at Emory. He's also on the board for the Rosalynn Carter Butterfly Trail, and a lot of his research has focused on the monarch butterflies and their connection with milkweed. So Dr. de Roode published a book this year conveniently called Doctors by Nature. Um, if you have not read it yet or haven't gotten it, we're going to include a link in the chat that'll give you 30% off if you go and buy it through that link. So Dr. de Roode lives here in Atlanta with his wife and two kids, and his cute little dog Tucky, who he actually has with him today, and you can see on this slide. And his habit or his curiosity around eating plants and dirt, a lot of that you'll read about in the book. So it's some of the fascination of how that connected. So, Dr. de Roode, turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, and thanks for having me, and thanks so much for everyone being here on this weekday evening. It's always great to see people come out for interesting talks about science and plants. And so, what I really want to do in this talk is really give you a glimpse of the many ways that animals use medication. And like you just said, there are so many examples that are really based on plants. So there's a very good connection with what you are all doing here. So. First of all, I want to dedicate this talk to Jane Goodall, who passed away, of course, several weeks ago, very sadly. But I want to dedicate the talk because so much of what I'm going to be talking about is really based on her, research and her ideas really breaking down the barrier between humans and animals, which is going to be very important for what we're talking about tonight. So, to start with, let me tell you the story of how I got into this topic in the first place. And it all starts with monarch butterflies. Now, monarch butterflies are very famous for their annual migration, when literally hundreds of millions of monarchs fly from Canada and the United States all the way down to Mexico, where they overwinter in massive, massive clusters. And when you go there, it's really fascinating because you see these trees and they're literally covered in these butterflies. You look up close and it's really layers upon layers of butterflies. And this is really what makes monarch butterflies so popular and so exciting that people dress up like them and organize festivals. And one of these festivals is held yearly in St. Mark's, Florida. My lab always goes there. That was actually this last weekend, although this year, unfortunately, the festival was canceled because of the government shutdown. But people in my lab still went there and talked to people about this migration. And this is what that looks like in that spot. This is really just right south of Tallahassee, just a beautiful area where these monarchs come through from the East Coast on their way along the Gulf toward Mexico. And the interesting thing is that I don't actually study monarch butterflies because they're pretty or because they do their migration, although that is something we are studying in my lab now as well. But really, what brought me to monarch butterflies is that they become sick. And so we often think of us becoming sick and our pets becoming sick, but wild animals also become sick, and monarch butterflies are no exception. So monarch butterflies get a parasite called Ophiocystis electroscira. A lot of people would call it OE. That's kind of the name that you may have seen around. And this is a parasite that is actually quite related to the parasites that cause malaria in humans. So it's a unicellular protozoan parasite, and it's actually quite damaging to monarch butterflies. And it can be so damaging that when there are a lot of parasites on the monarch body, so what the parasites do is they form these spores that sit on the abdomen of the butterfly, and that can be hundreds of thousands or millions of them. And when there are, excuse me, when there are that many, it can really disrupt the butterfly. And in this case, we see that because this butterfly is not coming out of its chrysalis at all. It's so disrupted by this parasite that it will be stuck. And of course, nature is nature, so we have this beautiful paper wasp that's really taking advantage of the situation and treating that monarch butterfly as food for her sisters at this point. Now, what is really nice about this system, if you're interested in understanding the effects of infectious disease on wild populations, is that it's a parasite is very easy to study. So we can just put a little sticker on the abdomen of a butterfly and pull it off. And what that will do is it's going to pull off some of the scales that cover the butterfly. And then when you look at this, you see all those little black dots. Those are the parasites. And so we can test to see whether a butterfly is infected, whether it has this disease, without harming it. And I often like to say that it's even less invasive than when we stick one of those things up our nose to see if we have COVID. But what that allows us to do is really to determine how many monarchs are infected, and then also to see how many of them actually make it to Mexico. And it turns out when the monarchs are infected, they have a much lower probability to get to Mexico. And the reason for that is it's like when we think about running a marathon and we're sick, that's going to be way harder. So we see a lot of these butterflies just cannot make it, and in a way that actually reduces the parasite prevalence as well in the population. Excuse me. And so what happens is that these parasites form these spores, like I said, on the abdomen of the butterfly. And then when females lay eggs on milkweed, because milkweeds are the only species that monarchs can use as caterpillars, the parasites will actually get stuck to the eggs and to the milkweed on which the eggs are laid. And then the caterpillars eat them up. And that is how they become infected, because the parasites end up in their guts and then they start infecting the tissues of the butterfly. And then they really start reproducing to high levels. So that when the monarch comes out of the chrysalis again, it's covered again in hundreds of thousands or millions of these parasite spores. And so I came to Georgia. I came to Atlanta in 2005, and the plan was for me to be here for 3 years to do studies on this parasite. And now we're almost 21 years later, I'm still here. And the reason is very much this beautiful system that I have been able to study through university professorship and really thinking about how the different plants that monarchs use can work as a medicine. And so I learned very quickly when I first came here, I knew that monarchs had this parasite. I also knew that monarchs could only eat milkweeds as larval food. And of course, if you give a monarch butterfly lettuce or an oak leaf, it's going to die. It cannot eat that. It has to be milkweed. Um, but there are different species of milkweed, and some of those are very toxic. And that's because they contain these chemicals called cardenolides, and other species are not very toxic at all. And people had often looked at this from the point of view of protection against predators, because the monarch butterflies are not just resistant to the toxins, they can also put them in their own tissues, and that makes them toxic to their predators, such as birds. But of course, I came from this background. I had done my PhD on parasites, and parasites is what brought me to the monarch butterfly. So I wanted to know if these same toxic chemicals can also work like a medicine, whether it actually can reduce parasite infection. And that turned out to be the case. So when you rear monarch butterfly caterpillars on different species, when they eat the species that have higher concentrations of these cardenolides, they have a much lower probability of becoming sick. And when they do become sick, their disease symptoms are not as severe. So these more toxic milkweeds can really act as a medicine. And so that's one of the first things I found out when I had started studying these monarch butterflies and their milkweeds. But when we found that, it was a really interesting question to me to find out, can the monarchs use this, actively use this? So in other words, when they're sick, are they preferentially going to use this medicinal milkweed? And then we did multiple experiments. In some of them, we gave caterpillars that were sick or healthy the choice between this medicinal and non-medicinal milkweed. And the caterpillars had absolutely no preference. They just ate what came their way first. So when they were in a container with different species, just whatever they walked into first, that is what they were going to eat. But I mean, you think about that, that kind of makes sense, because in the wild, it's not really the caterpillars making the choices what they're going to eat, right? It's really the mothers that decide what their offspring are going to eat, because the mothers lay their eggs on the plant. So the caterpillar is born essentially on the food. So with that in mind, we then wanted to test whether it's actually the mothers that make the choices. And so we did experiments where we had sick and healthy female butterflies that were pregnant, And we put them in these big cages and we gave them a choice to lay eggs on a medicinal and a non-medicinal plant. And then we could simply see how many eggs did they lay on the two different species. And what we found is that the infected butterflies had a very strong preference to lay their eggs on this medicinal milkweed, and uninfected butterflies did not. And so what is interesting about that is that you have these female butterflies that already have these parasites and they're going to spread them to their eggs. They cannot avoid that. Also, they're already sick, so they cannot actually recover themselves. But what they can do is when they are sick, is to lay their eggs on more toxic plants so that when the caterpillars come out, they're going to get the parasites from their mother, but they're also at the same time getting this medicine, and that's going to reduce their probability of infection, but also their disease symptoms. So I think this is a really great case of mommy knows best. And so these monarch butterflies are just really good at making these overposition choices. And in this case, based on infection and really providing medicine to their offspring caterpillars. So that was, research that we completed just over 10 years ago or so. But it was really against this backdrop of very firm beliefs in the scientific community that have been long-standing that only humans can use medicine. And, this is a quote from William Osler, who was one of the founders of Johns Hopkins University. So someone who's really very, very, very good medical doctor. But he said, desire to take medicines is one of those things that really distinguishes humans from other animals. And this has been a long-standing idea, and it wasn't really until the 1980s that we really got the first evidence that animals can use medicine, and that was a very big breakthrough. But it came from chimpanzees, and so it was a little bit more palatable at the time because chimpanzees are a little bit more like humans, of course, than caterpillars. But the story of this, and this is all based on plants as well. And so the story is that the research that was done, the people that discovered that chimpanzees can use medicine was a team of two researchers. And one of them was Mike Hoffman, who is shown here in this picture with a monkey in Japan. And it's important that he did his training in primatology in Japan. He actually came from the United States, but he did all his training in Japan. And that is very important because in Japan, they have always grown up with other primate species, but also their religion is very much based on Shintoism as well as Buddhism. And the deer in this picture here is one of those messengers of the Shinto gods. The importance about that religion is that in that religion, there is no clear difference between animals and humans. And so they really view the world as a continuum. And so they don't have trouble seeing what we may call human qualities in animals as well. And the important thing is that Huffman was working together with a ranger of Tanzania National Parks who was also a traditional healer. So came to this research from a completely different point of view. Now, they were studying chimpanzees not to find out about medicine. They were studying them to figure out what is the role of older chimpanzees in chimpanzee societies. And importantly, in their tradition of this Japanese primatology, they gave the chimpanzees names. This is actually something that Jane Goodall did as well in the 60s when she started studying these chimpanzees. But she also realized that these animals have personalities and they have traits that a lot of other people would strictly call human traits. And so they were following this particular group of chimpanzees, and one of the chimpanzees in that group was named Chausiku. And they found that she was behaving very differently on this specific day. She was lethargic. She built a nest in the middle of the day, which is not normal. She was on her side defecating, which is not normal. She had very dark urine. And it really seemed to suggest that she wasn't doing well. She wasn't feeling good. And then they witnessed her go to a plant, and she went. This was a shrub, and she took off the branches and then stripped off the bark, and then started sucking on the inner pith of the plant. And at this point, Mohammedi tells Mike Hoffman that this plant is called Mjonso, and that translates to bitter leaf. And this is a plant that the traditional healers in his community use for all sorts of infections. And so that's really the first time that Mike Hoffman thinks, well, maybe this chimpanzee is using this as medicine as well. And so the next day, they go back, they find Chausiku, and she recovers after about 23 hours after using this plant. And that is exactly the same amount of time that the traditional healers expect the plant to have its efficacy. So that was an observation, and then what Huffman and his colleagues did was really figure out, what chemicals are in these plants, and they found there's chemicals in there that can kill parasitic worms, and then they found out that chimpanzees often have these worms, and they found out that the concentrations of these chemicals that the chimpanzees use is enough to actually kill the worms in their guts. They found out that more chimpanzees do this when it's a wet season, when there's a lot of parasite infections. So bit by bit, they really put together this whole forensic story, if you will, to show that this chimpanzee was actually using medicine and then discover it in other chimpanzees as well. So, plants, I've mentioned milkweeds, I just mentioned bitterleaf, and of course, we're here all with plant lovers. And, what is so interesting about plants is that they are an amazing source of medicines. And this is true for animals and it is true for humans as well. Just think about, the opium poppy is, of course, a very good example of a drug that we get directly from plants. And really, when we think about most of the medicines and drugs we use, whether in traditional medicine or in our modern medicine, where we have actually built on the knowledge from all these plants and extracted the chemicals that make them medicinal to purify them in all these purified pills. And so the idea of plants having medicinal properties has been around for a long time. And at the same time that Huffman and Mohammadi were studying chimpanzees, there were a lot of other researchers that were looking at birds. And what they found is that birds often add aromatic plants to their nests. And there were a lot of hypotheses for this, but one of the leading hypotheses became that these birds do it to fumigate their nests so that they keep all sorts of ectoparasites that suck the blood of the chicks and the adults in these nests to keep them away. And this wasn't really tested very well until very recently. And so the picture on the right here is a sidewalk in Mexico City. This is the university in Mexico City. And if you look carefully, there are some littered cigarette butts there. Because it turns out that the cigarette butts are used by birds and actually tell us that that whole idea of plants using or birds using plants is actually truly a way that they keep parasites away from themselves. And so this is the story of Montse Suarez Rodriguez, who was an undergraduate student at the university there in Mexico City. And she was very interested in finding out what the effects are of urbanization and pollution and trash on the nest building of birds. And so she was looking at house sparrows and house finches. And when she was looking at their nests, she often found a lot of white, fluffy material in them. And she couldn't really figure out what it was until it was raining. And then she smelled smoke. And what she realized is that what these birds are doing is they're picking up the cigarette butts, the filters of the cigarette butts from the floor, pulling out all the white fibers of the filter and then lining their nests with it. And she also found that when the birds have more of these cigarette butts in their nest, they have fewer parasites. And then she did this really ingenious experiment where she tried to figure out how can I manipulate these nests without the birds rejecting them. And that took her 2 years to do that. But when she figured that out, she could manipulate the nest so she could give these nests to the birds and either add live ticks, so the bloodsuckers, the ticks that we get when we go for a hike, or she killed those ticks and added them to the nest, or added no ticks at all. And then she would observe how many cigarette butts these birds were going to collect. And she found that when there were live ticks, the birds collected more cigarette butts. And this reduced the number of ectoparasites, such as the ticks, but also lice and other things. And this helped the chicks survive, and they had higher survival and higher fledgling success. So but what that really means is that these birds, and this is interesting too, because these birds are inventive, but they're also kind of lazy, right? Because wild birds would use tobacco plants, but these birds are using cigarettes. But what it comes down to in the end is that these birds are collecting these chemicals that plants have produced for all sorts of other reasons, and then the birds use them as medicine, in this case, to keep parasites away. The other really interesting thing about this story to me is that it also shows that medicine is not free. And so, we all know cigarettes are not good. And I am definitely not trying to tell people that they should start smoking or throwing cigarette butts all over the floor because it's actually really detrimental. And this is true for the birds as well. So even though the cigarette butts reduced parasites, it also caused some problems in the blood cells of these birds. And so when we think about side effects, this is true for all the medicines we use as humans, but it's true for the medicines that animals use as well. So if you rear a monarch butterfly on an extremely toxic milkweed, it's gonna die as a caterpillar. And these chimpanzees that use this bitter leaf, if they eat too much of it, they can die as well, right? And so that is something that we and animals have in common, that medicines have these side effects. So at the time, the chimpanzees and the birds started in the 1980s, and that was kind of palatable for people, like I said earlier, because at least chimpanzees are a little bit like us. But right now we know that there are so many different animals that use medicine, and that includes insects. So here we see wood ants. This is in the Jura Mountains in Switzerland, where these ants collect large amounts of resin. And so resin is the sticky stuff that plants produce. Sometimes when you touch a plant, it gets sticky, or if you have a Christmas tree, right, and you use your hands, you get that sticky stuff on it. Resin is really the stuff that the trees produce to heal wounds, and that also prevents all sorts of infections of the wounds on the trees. And these ants take advantage of that. They put it in their nest, and it protects their brood, their babies, against all sorts of infections with viruses, bacteria, and fungi. And the same is true for honeybees. So I love this picture because this shows a honeybee that's just been out collecting this resin of plants. And this stuff is so sticky that when she comes back to the nest, she needs other workers to help her remove it. And then what they do is they produce the wax that they make and mix it with this resin and make it into a substance called propolis. And propolis is a really interesting substance when you look at wild bees that say live in hollow trees that have really rough surfaces around them. They fill up all these crevices and these rough surfaces with this propolis. It's very shiny, beautiful, shiny envelope. And the interesting thing is that people have used propolis for thousands and thousands of years, and we know it's medicinal, but somehow people never realized that bees use it for the same reason. Now, honeybees are very important. Of course, native bees are really important, but when we think about agriculture and we think about huge crop pollination, these honeybees are very important. And without the bees, we would lose a lot of the different foods that we rely on. And the problem is that honeybees aren't doing well. Native bees aren't doing well either. But if we focus on honeybees here, what we can see here, for example, on this bee on the left, there is this Varroa destructor mite. So this is a very detrimental mite that essentially sucks out the liver of these bees and transmits all sorts of really dangerous viruses. And so that's one of the things that we're seeing in the bees. There's all sorts of diseases. The honeybees aren't doing well. And one of the reasons for that is that we don't let bees use medication anymore. So that propolis that humans have used as medicine for a long time, bees use it as medicine as well. And so what researchers have shown now is that this propolis keeps a lot of mites away, but also viruses, bacteria, fungal infections. The problem is it's very sticky and beekeepers don't like it. And so when you look especially at the industrial beekeeping industry, there is a very big push to remove this sticky stuff because the bees put it at the top where the lid hits the box. And so it's hard to remove the lid and do the work in the box. And so beekeepers have removed it and they have selected against this over time. And in that way, we have basically removed a lot of the medicinal properties of, or the medicinal behaviors of these honeybees. The good thing is it's actually really easy to bring back. And researchers have shown that when you use very rough planks instead of smooth planks, you make grooves in the sides of the planks, that the bees will fill that up with this propolis and start medicating themselves again. We see similar things in the livestock industry. So what is interesting about livestock and honeybees is that we as humans tend to think that we know everything better. And so it's the same when you look at domesticated animals such as sheep, goats, cattle. We think that we know better what they need than those animals because we kind of dumb them down is the idea. And so what we're doing in the livestock industry is we're giving all these animals a very standardized rationed food that supposedly has all the nutrients in it that the animal needs. But what it doesn't include is the natural medicines that animals normally use. And so to take care of all sorts of diseases, we then add all these antibiotics and these anthelmintics, which causes a lot of resistance and a lot of problems. But research by Juan Villalba and colleagues at Utah State University, they have looked at this for decades now and actually found that these animals are really good at regulating their own diet, but also at finding the medicine that they need. And so what they have shown is that, say you have a sheep or a goat is infected with worms, you give them a particular plant with a lot of tannins, that it cures them of these parasites. The animals now feel better, and the next time they feel sick, they're going straight for that food. So they're really good at learning to use medicine through associations, eating something, feeling better, next time they're going to use it. And so what these researchers are really, you know, lobbying for is to say, well, let's bring our animals back outside, right? Let's put them in a paddock and let's make those paddocks very diverse. So let's make sure these paddocks have a lot of different plants, not just one food, but a lot of different medicines that the animals can eat. They can use it to cure themselves when they're already sick or find all sorts of antioxidants that are involved in preventative health and really keep the animals healthy. So one of the questions is always, how do animals actually know what they're doing? And this was really one of the things that stood in the way of this field in the 1980s when people said animals are just not smart enough, right? Humans go to college and then medical school and then do residency. It takes a lot of time to become a doctor. And so that is still a big question. But one of the interesting things is that animals don't really need to know that they're using medicine and they can still use it. And so a great example of that comes from woolly bear caterpillars. Woolly bear caterpillars, unlike monarch butterflies, can eat a lot of different plants as larvae. So they actually move from one plant to another throughout the day. They can eat a lot of different ones. And some of those plants contain really high concentrations of chemicals called alkaloids that are really detrimental to parasitoid flies. So parasitoid flies are these kind of gruesome alien parasites. I have an example here of a picture I took myself of a monarch butterfly that had been infected by them. And what these flies do essentially is they lay their eggs on a caterpillar. The maggots come out of the eggs, they eat their way onto the inside of the caterpillar, eat up the caterpillar, and then when they're ready to turn into an adult fly, they burst out. Very much like the alien in the Alien movie from 1979. And these caterpillars, these woolly bears get them too. There's an egg there on that part of the caterpillar there. But it turns out when these caterpillars eat these alkaloids, it can actually kill the flies. And really amazing research has shown that these caterpillars have four taste receptors, and one of them specifically tastes these alkaloids. And what researchers then did, they managed to put tiny little electrodes in the individual taste buds of these caterpillars, and then looked at infected and uninfected caterpillars and gave them these alkaloids. And what they found is that these taste receptors respond much more strongly to the alkaloids when the caterpillar is sick. And so what that means is that when they're sick, they're infected with these flies, these alkaloids taste better, therefore they eat more, therefore they get the dose that actually kills the flies, right? And so at the end, what that means is that the caterpillar doesn't actually need to know that it's sick. It doesn't need to know what a parasitoid fly is. It doesn't need to know what an alkaloid is. All it knows, or the body knows, right, is that these alkaloids taste good, so it eats more and thereby cures itself. So I think that is probably true for a lot of different animals and not just in insects. I think that is true for a lot of mammals as well. It's not the only way that animals can develop these medicinal behaviors. The individual learning I just mentioned for the goats and the sheep is very important as well. So this associative learning, you eat something and you recover, then you make that association. You're going to use that again when you feel sick. And then on top of all that, there is also social learning. And this is really when animals learn from each other. And this goes back again to Jane Goodall, because what she noticed in the 1960s is when she was looking at chimpanzees, she often found in the dung of chimpanzees, she found these leaves that were completely undigested. So whole leaves that were in the feces of the chimpanzees, undigested, unchewed. And it wasn't again until the 1980s that Huffman and his colleagues really started looking at this and found that chimpanzees often do this. They often swallow whole leaves, and these leaves are always very rough. So they have a lot of hairs on them. And what they found is that by doing that, it scrapes parasites out of the guts, and it also irritates the gut, so they poop all these parasites out. The problem for the chimpanzees is that these leaves can be that size. It's really, really hard to swallow that. So what they do, they fold it up and then swallow it. And as you can imagine, there are many different ways to fold a leaf, and different groups of chimpanzees use different ways. And what that means is that within a group, you have one individual that comes up with a method, and then all the other chimpanzees copy that behavior in that group. So now you have culture, you've got medicine, right? Two things that we used to think are, human traits, but it's right there in animals. But that copying behavior can be very important for animals to acquire these medical behaviors. Dogs. So, I have my own dogs here. Here's one of them in my lap. The other one is by my feet. So this is little Cooper here. And so a lot of us who have dogs will know that our dogs like eating grass. And it's the same for our cats as well. This is my other dog. This is Tucky, and he's eating grass here, and you can really see him going wild sometimes. He sometimes really, really goes at it. And what's been really interesting to me is reading through the literature and finding out why do our pets do this, is that there's very little research on this topic. But what we do know is that a lot of wild carnivores eat grass as well. So when we look at many decades of research that has been done on wild carnivores, whether it is mountain lions or wolves or coyotes, you see them often eat grass. And a recent study that I'm showing here, this is from earlier in the year, um, we found that, or researchers found this jaguar in South America eating grass and then really throwing up, these parasites. And this is what we see in a lot of these carnivores. They eat grass and then either throw up afterwards or they poop afterwards and they expel parasites. Now, that doesn't mean that when our dogs, like this one in my lap here, when he eats grass, that they have parasites. But what it often does mean is that they have an upset stomach. And so there was one time that my Cooper here, he had eaten half a rubber band that he found on the floor of my son's bedroom amidst a lot of other stuff on that floor. And he had eaten it, and then he ate grass during our morning walk, and 6 hours later he threw up, and there it came out, right? So I think what this all means is that these animals in our care, our pets can still respond to this discomfort that they feel by eating the grass and then getting rid of whatever is harming them and making them feel bad. So our pets are still able to use medicine, and this is also very true for our cats. And so the next story I want to tell is based on catnip and silvervine. So catnip is very common here, plant that our cats love rolling around in, and they go all happy and all go crazy when they use this plant, and they can roll around for 15 minutes or so. And you can even buy it in the supermarket, right? Or the pet market, and you can buy toys that are impregnated with the chemicals. So people have known about this catnip response for a very long time. And silvervine is a similar plant that occurs in Southeast Asia, which is actually even more potent. And we have known for a long time, so you look at folk stories in Japan from hundreds of years ago, there are stories of mice essentially intoxicating the cats with the silvervine so they can win a battle with them. So why they are doing this, that has remained a question until several years ago. And so what I'll show you now is several movies that were made by researchers in Japan that were really interested in finding out what this catnip response is about. So the first thing they do, they took this silvervine, these plants, and they extracted all the chemicals and put them in different fractions. And they put these chemicals in petri dishes and put those in a cage with a cat. And so then you see this cat going to all those different chemicals, sniffing them, and figuring out which is the most attractive. And then the cat is making his choice, right? So here, number 5, that is the chemical that really elicits the response. That is what causes the catnip response. And this cat is going crazy over it. It's really, really liking it. So why is it doing that? Well, it's doing that because cats, like humans, produce their own opioids as part of their pleasure response. So for those of you who run marathons, you get a runner's high. That is a similar idea of these cats experiencing this high when they're using these chemicals. And so in this experiment shown here, this was the same cat on day one and day two. On day one, the cat got a saline solution, just a salt solution. Whereas on day two, they gave it a chemical that blocks this whole pleasure response. So this cat can no longer feel that euphoria that it normally associates with these chemicals. And so we see on day one, this cat is having a good time. It's really starting to lick it. It's going to roll around pretty soon. Whereas on day two, the cat just doesn't care anymore. That chemical is no longer interesting because it's not giving it pleasure. So that's really the mechanism by which the cats like this. But why are they so excited about this? And so when the researchers were at a particular conference, they ran into another researcher who studied mosquitoes. And she said, what strikes me when I look at these cats is that they're not just rolling around. It really seems like they're coating themselves in these chemicals. They're really trying to get that chemical all over their bodies. And to test that idea, the researchers then decided to put the chemicals at the top of the cage with the idea that if the cats roll around just for fun, they would still do it. In this case, they would go down to the bottom and roll around. But if it's that rolling around is really to get the chemicals in the fur, then the cat should try to roll around at the top of the cage. And of course, rolling around at the top of the cage doesn't work very well because of gravity. And we can see that with this cat here. So this cat is having a hard time actually getting to, you know, getting the chemicals in its fur. So with all that, the researchers then did tests to really figure out that these cats coat themselves in these chemicals as a repellent to mosquitoes. So the next thing they did, they looked at these cats, they gave them the chemical or not, and then put them on either side of a cage with mosquitoes and found that the cats that had the chemical didn't get as many mosquito bites. Now the researchers felt pretty bad for their cats because they love their cats, and so then they decided, well, let's go in the experiment ourselves. So they put the chemicals on their own arms, stuck their arms in the cage, and found the chemicals work for humans as well. And so now they have actually patented the chemical to see if they can develop it into a repellent for human use that keeps mosquitoes and all the diseases that they transmit away from them. And I love this story because what it is showing us is that our domesticated animals can still teach us really interesting things about medicines and the chemicals that are out there in plants and that we can copy and actually use. The biggest surprise for me related to that was this is not something new. And when you look at shamans and you look at traditional healers, they have looked at thousands, maybe millions of years at animals to discover medicine. You look at Native Americans here in North America, every tribe you look at, they have a particular medicine that is named after bears. And so by becoming bears during rituals, they really believe that you can learn from bears who they view as the master of medicine because bears really have a lot of knowledge about medicine. And, that involves a lot of different traditional medicines, but also something that most of us will have used at some point in our life, which is aspirin. And so aspirin comes from the willow bark. And what happened is that bears, when they come out of hibernation, they're all inflamed, they're all sore, they're all stiff. And the first thing they do is they go to a willow tree and eat the bark of it. And that bark contains a lot of salicylic acid that was later made into aspirin. So people copied this behavior from bears. This was passed on from people to people to people and eventually made into the pharmaceutical drug. And it's not just bears, it's elephants. You look at Southeast Asia, you look at Africa, and humans look at the elephants, come up with all sorts of treatments. In Tanzania, there is a treatment to relieve stomach upset that is based on a traditional healer that looked at an elephant with stomach upset, saw it use a particular tree, take the leaves, mix it with water in its pharyngeal pouch to make essentially a tea. And they're using this even to this day to treat the stomach upset in their area. People have also learned from goats. And so you may know the story about dancing goats and Caldi. So here at Emory, we have a dancing goats coffee bar, of course, in Decatur. We have that one, that's where it started. And this is based on the legend that there was a herder, a goat herder in what is now Ethiopia. His name was Caldi. And when he saw that the goats were eating the berries of the coffee bush, he saw them become all very active and dancing around. And he related that story to a monk at a nearby monastery who then brewed it into what we call coffee today, right? And so this is still something that a huge number of people use every day as really a stimulating drug that gets us through the day and maybe also through this presentation tonight. There's other things we have learned from goats. So there's such a thing as horny goatweed. You can order it on Amazon and you can guess what the herder realized when his goats were eating that. So animals can teach us a lot of different things, and they can teach us a lot about what plants to use. Because pretty much all the examples I've given today are based on plants. But the problem, of course, is that we are losing nature at a very rapid rate right now. And so the rate at which we're losing species is higher than the rate of extinctions. The last massive extinction event, which was the wipeout of most of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. And this is something why I am also part of the Rosalynn Carter Butterfly Trail, which was started by Miss Rosalynn Carter, really with the idea that we should really help our pollinators and that we should really bring back native habitats and recreate nature, because that's really the way to go to bring back a lot of plants and certainly a lot of the animals that use them. So what we are doing as an organization is really trying to encourage people to plant native gardens. My lab at Emory University, we're actually growing a lot of the plants and giving them out for free to people in the whole metro Atlanta area, really trying to get people to really buy into this idea that we can recreate some of the native habitats with our native plants and that help not just our pollinators, but also our pets. And one thing that I learned in writing this book that really surprised me again too was that the biggest crop in the United States is not corn, it's not soy, but it's grass, just lawn grass that really covers our front lawns and our golf courses, and that doesn't support any wildlife at all. It just takes a lot of water, a lot of fertilizer, and a lot of pesticides. And so when I moved to my current house almost 4 years ago now, there was all this horrible lawn in front, and I'm slowly replacing it with this native butterfly garden that is also part of the Rosalynn Carter Butterfly Trail. And that's attracting all these pollinators. Of course, I'm a little bit biased toward monarchs. I get very excited when I see them, but I get them through the year now in an area that was basically a biodiversity desert until I converted it to this garden. There's also a bee there on an echinacea. So we have these medicinal plants in our front yard and see all these animals use them. And I see my pets use them too. And one of the things we're only learning right now is that our pets don't just use plants to, for physical problems and parasites, but also for mental health. So having this huge diversity of native plants is just really a great way to recreate native habitats, help the pollinators, but also help other animals, including our own pets. And so what I want to close with is just this little video of my dogs that are eating grass here. And this was actually earlier in the year when my book came out. The university wanted to write a story about it in the university newspaper. And so we were doing a photo shoot on the Emory campus. And as we were setting up the lights, my dogs were just standing there eating this grass. And it was almost like they were saying, I don't know what all this fuss is about. You make it sound like all of this stuff is new. But we, animals, have known for millions of years that we use medicine. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Dr. De Roode. That's very insightful. So in the book, you mentioned Tucky, but you didn't mention Cooper. So I was wondering how old Cooper was.
Oh yeah, because when I wrote the book, Cooper wasn't around yet. Um, Cooper, we rescued just over a year ago, and between writing a book and getting it in the stores, it's a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So good. So one of the things I have a question. So we've had beagles, and um, the grass that we have, the long grass, which we try to reduce every year, is zoysia, and they don't really eat that. And so I just recently planted some sedges,
Hmm.
native sedges, and I find that they do eat
Yeah.
that. So it's not a grass, but it has the same,
Yeah.
long, slender tendency. So is it just the fact that that's the texture, or
Yeah, they love. So what you see with these wild carnivores, they often go for really sharp and rough grasses. Sometimes when you pull grass, it can even like give you a cut in your fingers. So it turns out they really like the ones that are more scrapey. And you see that with the chimpanzees, they choose leaves that are very, very rough, very, very hairy. And so we see that with carnivores too, is that they prefer to eat plants that, in some cases, even goats don't want to eat it. That's how sharp it is.
Yeah. Good. So we have two questions in the Q&A. So if you have some more, go ahead and add those in and we'll get to them. But Sally wanted to know how common is the OE parasite in the Piedmont region, and can certain milkweed plants be a carrier for this parasite?
Yeah, so it's pretty common. So overall, until about 20 years ago, about, 1 in 200, 1 in 100 monarchs was infected with this parasite. If we look now, we just, people in my life just came back from St. Mark's looking at the migrants there, and it's well over 10% now. So the parasites have become much, much more common. And one of the problems that we're seeing with increasing the parasite prevalence is the planting of non-native milkweed. And so there's this plant, Asclepias curassavica, tropical milkweed, which is a beautiful plant, very easy to grow, but it's also, which is weird because it's called tropical milkweed, but it's more cold hardy than the native milkweeds in our area. And so what it does, it survives longer in some places even throughout the whole winter. And so it can support these monarch breeding over the season. And that allows these monarchs to keep on putting parasites on those plants. And that's really driving that prevalence up. So really what I always tell people is don't go for the tropical milkweed, go for the natives. They die back early in the fall. And when they die, the parasites die with them. And the monarchs then the next year can start fresh without those parasites.
Good. So Elizabeth has a similar question. Which milkweed is medicinal to monarchs? Is it
So,
or
yeah, and any species that has higher concentrations of cardenolite. So, for example, when you look at Asclepias tuberosa, the butterfly weed, it hardly has any of these chemicals. Common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca, has more. And then some of the highest ones are Asclepias perennis, which you find in more southern portions of Georgia. And then, if you go to the desert, there's some really toxic ones. But, there's variation. It's not like medicinal versus non-medicinal. There's all gradations. It just really depends on the concentration.
good. So switching topics. So Miranda asked, are there any studies being done about deer in planting native? I've learned to share with our resident deer, and I wonder what plants they may eat for medicine.
That's a really great question. I have no answer to it, unfortunately. I'm not aware of any studies on deer and what kind of plants they use for medicine. Of course, we know deer can be quite destructive to our native plant gardens. But whether they use any of that as there were some studies also suggesting they like to eat particular plants, including willow, if they are sick. So just like bears, they seem to go for some of that salicylic acid. But beyond that, I'm not aware of any studies.
Yeah, and so Dana says our Great Danes eat swamp sunflower leaves. Have you seen that in dogs in addition to grass?
Sunflower leaves? Is that what you said?
Yeah, it's swamp sunflowers.
Um, yeah, well, I have seen my dogs eat dry leaves, like in the fall when you got the really rough, sharp dry leaves. So I think the texture is more important than the actual plant. So yeah, I think they can eat all sorts of things. Um, Generally, they seem to like grass, but occasionally they eat other stuff as well.
So since they're mainly, I guess, known dogs coming from wolves are known as carnivores, if you were
Mhm.
to, like we plant pollinator plants or pollinator gardens, if you were to plant for your dog when they get sick, what would you plant other than grass?
Oh, so I was talking to a researcher in Bath in the United Kingdom, and she is working with these basically animal shelters to create these gardens where animals can find a lot of different things. And so they for example have a lot of bark of different trees, including willows, so they can eat that to basically reduce arthritis and inflammation. There are a lot of people that are planting things such as valerian, which is really calming for cats, and maybe also for dogs. And then there's other things that they can really use to protect themselves against mosquitoes, even things such as basil and stuff like that, where they you know, can get some of those smells on them. But beyond that, it's really still something that is in its infancy, just to figure out what the animals all use and what they can have. But my feeling with my dogs is when I look at them, is that they always surprise me with what they like. So I just try to put as many different native plants in my garden, and know it's gonna be of use to someone. If not my dogs, then another, maybe a squirrel. I don't know.
That's a good answer for the Native Plant Society.
Hmm.
So if you have not ordered the book, again, there's a link in the chat where you can go do that and get a discount. So we're getting close to the top of the hour. So before we go, I read on your website that you're working on an additional book or a follow-on book. You want to tell us a little bit about what that one's going to be about?
Yeah, so the next book I really liked writing this book, so I was really sad when it was done. And like I said, it takes so long between finishing it and it coming out. So I was ready for the next one. The next one is gonna be also very much biological. It's gonna be about arms races in nature. And so really thinking about, when you think about arms races like the Cold War, nuclear powers, like one kind, basically it's this escalation, right? So more and more nuclear warfare, at least possibilities. And you see that in nature too, that kind of escalation. So it's really trying to figure out or explaining why there are certain things in nature that we may take for granted, but that just essentially don't make sense. And so maybe in terms of what is interesting for this audience, one of the chapters I've written so far is really to talk about why we have mustard. So mustard is essentially chemicals, and we like it in mustard, we like it in wasabi, right? These are chemicals that are actually really toxic to most animals and most insects. And the reason that some plants have so many of these chemicals is that for millions of years there has been this arms race between cabbage white butterflies and the crucifer plants that they use. And every time the plants produce more toxin, the butterflies become more resistant. So the plants produce more toxin, they become more resistant. So it just escalates to these really high levels. So without that arms race, we would have very boring hot dogs on the 4th of July.
Good. So Kimberly asked a question, what native Asclepias has the highest um, cardinaloids?
In Georgia, that would be Asclepias perennis.
And what's that common name?
Oh, I always forget what the common name is. Is it yeah, so I would have to look it up. I'm always confused. It's yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Perennis. That's the yeah.
Yeah. Good. So thanks again for everybody joining, and thank you, Dr. DeRude, for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it.